Hi, everybody. Welcome to the final week. And this week we'll be talking about schizophrenia and its treatment, pharmacological and otherwise. Let's begin. So just some things out of the way. I've been asked, is the final exam cumulative? Not really. It's really definitely focused on the material after exam two, but it always helps, of course, even with exam two, to know your stuff about autoreceptors, maybe the HPA axis, microglia, the mechanisms of synaptic transmission. Knowing all that, of course, helps. So if you felt weak on that from, let's say, exam one, you might want to review again. And again, it's not my fault, but yes, the exam is at 8 a.m. That's the official schedule. Just reminding you because some of us may need to set alarm clocks for that very early hour. Um, and just a note on the readings, kind of similar to the readings for the depression section, is that the book really goes to town on a lot of the very specific drugs and brand name drugs that are used to treat schizophrenia. I cover the core ones in my lectures, and those are the ones that you'll be responsible for, not, let's say, the new cutting edge specific variation of a drug. So if it's in the lectures, then it's important, but you'll see that the book has far more than I discuss, so you don't have to worry about knowing all the details on those. Okay, moving forward. Let's do the overall roadmap for today is kind of like we've done before in the past, is I give more of a view of the symptoms, the historical context and treatments, in this case of schizophrenia, and then how it's classified officially. And then we'll go into some of the causes, at least the genetic and developmental origins of schizophrenia, how certain things might contribute in the environment as well. And also potentially the impact of marijuana use, at least when you're younger, how that may contribute to the onset of schizophrenia if you have that predisposition. All right, and then we'll go a little bit into what might be wrong in the brain, at least with the balance of neurotransmitters like dopamine and glutamate. And then in the next class on Thursday, we'll dive in much more deeply into the drugs and the synaptic and neurotransmitter mechanisms that might be disrupted in schizophrenia. Okay, what is it like to have schizophrenia? Honestly, it's one of the more nightmarish disorders that I think you can imagine because you see your own mind fracturing in front of you. And you sometimes are very much aware that your mind is fracturing in front of you. Here are two quotes from some people who have schizophrenia and were able to kind of describe what it felt like to them. The one on the left, if I hear somebody psychically communicating with me, which I don't believe in, I'm a complete atheist. Then the sound will come from above their head or behind their hair, even from inside their stomach. It's somewhere between their actual mouth, she says. It's not as loud as their real voice, it's softer, but I don't think the tone and quality of the voice is compromised. So they clearly know it's not real, but they can't help hearing it. I don't believe in anything. That's my cardinal rule. I do it for my mental health. If I believe in God, then I start talking to God, and God starts talking to me. As soon as I start believing in something, then it talks to me. So I don't believe in anything. And so those are just some interesting examples, especially of the auditory hallucinations that are just canonical, very standard features of schizophrenia. You hear voices. And about 60 to 80% of people diagnosed with schizophrenia do hear voices. And why it's auditory and not visual, they're all really interesting questions that we don't know the answer to. Okay, the word itself, schizophrenia. Schizo means, Greek at least, and it means split. It's like a break, a fracturing of the mind. So phrenia is the mind, or phrene is the mind. So it's as if your mind is breaking apart. Now, that's very accurate in the fact that if you have schizophrenia, many will report that it's like their mind is not themselves. It's broken into pieces. Their whole personality is broken into pieces. But that's not to be confused with split or multiple personality conditions, which it is not. It's not like you have multiple personalities. It's that your own personality, it seems to be broken into bits and pieces and is unorganized, and you constantly cycling between these different bits. It's like at least it's been described by schizophrenics as more like a shattering of your personality or mind. And it has been discussed and described very eloquently because many schizophrenics are extremely highly functioning. For example, Ellen Sachs here is a professor in the School of Law, chaired professor. She's brilliant. She talks very eloquently about what it's like having schizophrenia. And please, again, it's hard for me to show it through these videos. I'm not sure if they'll upload and they make the files obscenely big. But go ahead and follow that link to the TED Talk. It's actually a great, I think it's like 12 or 14 minutes, but it's just Ellen just describing her life experience suffering with schizophrenia and how it had these ups and downs, these positive hallucinations, these feelings of just where you just couldn't stop saying things that were not true and delusional thinking. And then diving down into what we'll talk about as well, the negative symptoms that look very much like depression, but aren't depression, but these positives and negative symptoms of schizophrenia, and this unending noise in her mind. And then the kind of following isolation and just utter fear she felt when you can be a witness to your own mental dissolution. And she also mentioned some very interesting points about how her disorder was treated. And in many cases, those treatments weren't very enlightened at all. Sometimes she was physically restrained for 24 hours. And now if you can imagine being somebody who's aware that your mind is fracturing, and maybe being a little paranoid and being just kind of generally terrified, period, then having these big burly guys come over you and restrain you to a bed or a chair, it's got to be just adding so much more to that fear. So I mean, she brings up a very good point about how physical restraint needs to be limited, and it has been, but not perhaps enough. All right, and then it also, I mean, I think her talk also speaks to the power of treatment, and largely pharmacological treatment, and how it helped her recover and become fully functioning, and by far more than fully functioning. Another famous and incredibly intelligent human being who suffered from paranoid schizophrenia was John Forbes Nash, or people know him as John Nash, and he became famous in the popular culture with the movie A Beautiful Mind, who had Russell Crowe playing his character. And for those into mathematics, into game theory, and other things, you might have heard of him as well. He actually developed this idea of Nash equilibrium when he studied how competitors, if you're competing in a game, let's say a game of tic-tac-toe or chess, or some other game like in global politics, who would win a nuclear war? And this is where this field of game theory really took off, is to study how the games of life and death that would be played with during the Cold War, how we could or could not win. Nash, was very interested in modeling those types of games of any type, but generally some sort of competitive game, to see what state the game would end in. Would it end in a tie? Would it end in somebody winning? But he founded a lot of the mathematical ideas that really predicted how those competitive games would end. And so he came up with this idea of this Nash equilibrium. I'm sure it was named after him. He probably didn't call it that himself, but it was an idea where, for example, the simplest example maybe is if you're playing tic-tac-toe against somebody else, and both of you really know the rules, you will never win. Neither of you will ever win, because you truly know the rules. If you think very carefully about the game, it will always end in a tie. And so that's the Nash equilibrium for tic-tac-toe, and he's then extended that to many other types of competitive games. Anyway, I say that because it also shows how somebody with schizophrenia, this fracturing, disabling disorder, does not condemn you to having an incredible creative mind, and how it can be managed with a combination of therapy and pharmaceutical treatment. All right, I just wanted to show a little art too to get the feeling of what it's like to experience schizophrenia. These are just a couple of these are drawings from people who've had or have schizophrenia. Just I think I don't know what they're exactly illustrating here, but I mean very nicely drawn items. But I think it kind of symbolizes that fracturing and the many thoughts driving all over, and the kind of the terror of having schizophrenia. These images usually are not very relaxing. I mean, it's another one where it's this kind of more scrambling of your self and psyche. Here, here's another one where you feel like your personality is being fractured or pulled apart. You don't know who you are, perhaps, at any given time. And another one. I don't know exactly how to interpret that, but yes, more of a fracturing of disjointed ideas jumping all over. And this, I'm not sure if somebody made this or just something online, but yeah, just that idea that you're jumping between different conditions and mental states. Broadly, I think individuals with schizophrenia, they have many symptoms. Again, like I mentioned, a common one is these hallucinations, these auditory hallucinations of hearing voices, but also many others, like holding very unrealistic ideas and beliefs, maybe hyper kind of strange religious-like beliefs or superstitions, communicating in a way that's really hard to understand. It might almost sound like they're kind of spitting out words that almost sound like a word salad. You know, it's just a nonstop talking that doesn't really follow any logical coherence. And it goes up and down. But often when it gets really bad, they definitely require them to become incapacitated. They can't take care of themselves, or they put themselves at grave risk, and walking out into traffic or doing things that are potentially dangerous. All right, so what are the symptoms? I mean, there are generally three canonical classes of symptoms of schizophrenia. So you have a mixture. It's like, and a person can be expressing more of one or the other at a given time. There are the classic positive symptoms, which you've already mentioned a bit, like the auditory hallucinations. They're when you have something, when something new is in your mind, like hallucinations, again, or delusions, like delusions of grandeur or delusions of persecution, when you think the world is out to get you. Or these kind of outbursts of illogical rantings that you might have, this kind of outgoing word salad of illogical thought. Then on the very different side, you have these negative symptoms, which is the absence of something. So by no means does positive mean good. Positive means something, and for a schizophrenic, very bad. So positive and negative they mean the class of symptom, not related to whether it's good or bad. Negative, on the other hand, means the lack of something. In this case, schizophrenics often go through periods where they feel this profound lack of emotion, motivation, this inability maybe to want to get off the couch or activity. This often looks like depression, but it's not really depression. It has some commonalities, and even some maybe antidepressant medications might help if they're in a negative phase, but generally it's treated as it's very specific to schizophrenia. And then there are cognitive symptoms, where it's the thought processes, not the emotional, but more of the thought processes are wrong, in that the very illogical thinking, there's no kind of logical thread to their thoughts from one to the other. And there's also very common issues with their ability to hold things into memory. So your ability to keep things like if you give somebody who has schizophrenia a phone number to remember, they may forget it far more early than somebody who doesn't have schizophrenia. All right, some factoids about schizophrenia, just to put into context where it is in society and historically. So it was described a long time ago. I mean, the canonical symptoms, these positive and negative symptoms, were described as early as 1000 BC. I forgot who described them, probably some Greek, my guess. So early on it was described. And it affects, in the current world, it affects about 1% of the world population. So 1 in 100 of people are affected. So in our class of 200 students, about 2 of you perhaps would have a chance of having schizophrenia. In the US, there are about 2.5 million people with the disease, and that's an important number because a lot of those people might be homeless. They may be institutionalized either in psychiatric institutions or commonly in jail or prison, which is not necessarily the best place for somebody with a neurological disorder to be. And so there are a lot of people in our country that are suffering from this disease. And it results in job loss, homelessness, and it's very costly because it requires persistent medical care. For example, there are medications, and the medications themselves, at least the common ones, aren't that expensive, but you often need to get many different updates and checks just to make sure, A, you're taking your medication and that the medications aren't hurting your body, because a lot of the medications for schizophrenia have really nasty side effects. In the end, though, the cost of treating and institutionalizing and the job loss cost, it adds up to at least $30 to $50 billion per year, which is a big cost to society. And I just wanted to say it again, just to remind you, schizophrenia is not split personality or multiple personality like disorder. It's different. It's a fracturing. It's not like you're 2 different people that are living 2 kind of separate lives in your brain. It's like your personality itself has been broken into very small pieces that you're losing control of. All right. I wanted to put this out here now too, because especially in the 50s and 60s, maybe even the 70s, schizophrenia, along with autism, was often blamed on early childhood experiences and specifically to poor mothering. And that's not the case. I just want to put it out there because sometimes those myths never die. They had this, at least for a long period of time, this idea of an emotionally cold refrigerator mother. And because of the experience with the cold mother who didn't give enough love to their children, and that's what's causing both autism and schizophrenia. And that's utterly wrong. That hypothesis is wrong. I just want to state it because it's still, sometimes you can hear it in the popular culture. That's not to say that stress, as we learned in the previous lectures about depression, can be a factor. And even in schizophrenia, childhood stress, maybe stress by the mother during development, those may play indeed factors. So there are factors that can play in during development that may relate to your environment. But this refrigerator mother or cold upbringing hypothesis and blaming the mother is sad, because the parents are suffering a great deal trying to raise somebody who is schizophrenic or autistic. All right. Clear in one of the canonical features that or these things we know about schizophrenia, is it has a very clear genetic component, just like many of the disorders we've talked about, alcoholism, depression, things like that. But in addition, there's also a very clear prenatal developmental component, and also a postnatal developmental component, which I'll talk about in the context of synaptic pruning. But the prenatal is as you're during gestation, well, maybe you're in later on, like 3rd trimester, if the mother exhibits some sort of insult or has issues, there is an increased risk for schizophrenia. But there's also a clear genetic component as well. And there's no economic or sexual or racial connection with schizophrenia in general. Although we'll see that there are some sexual differences, but the overall average rates are about the same in males and females. But I'll talk about that in a moment. All right. And the vast majority of people with schizophrenia are not violent. So you might see maybe on TV or something else that you do. Once in a while you do have the case of the violent person with schizophrenia. And of course, those are the people you remember. Like if you remember Jared Loughner, who was responsible for the horrible violence in Tucson a number of years back. Well, he had schizophrenia. And so it's those, unfortunately, those cases that people remember. But on average, the vast, vast majority of people with schizophrenia are not by any means violent and don't pose a danger to others. And there is good treatment, but there is absolutely no cure to schizophrenia. All right, and the causes of schizophrenia are unclear, but we'll talk a lot about some of the potential causes, and there is like a constellation of potential causes. And one sad little note too is the sense that the standard chemical pharmacological treatments for schizophrenia have not really fundamentally changed since the 1950s. We're still using effectively the same drugs, and even the new drugs we've developed don't necessarily even work as well as some of the drugs developed in the 50s. So it's kind of sad in the sense that you'd think with the advances of neuropharmacology, we would be better at treating it, but we haven't gotten better. All right, I mentioned sex differences, and on average, again, males and females get schizophrenia at about the same rate. Both males and females tend to get it more when they're young. The age of onset's around, well, in your 20s typically, between 16 and 25, whether you're a male or a man or a woman. But the rate is a little bit less at those younger years in women. So men tend to have the first schizophrenic type of episode, again, in around their 20s, where women also do, but the women have, relative to men, more of those happening later in life. So if a woman is a little more likely to have, let's say, schizophrenia in their 40s to 70s, whereas the males taper off a little more exponentially in their 20s to 30s. Okay, a little more on the history of treating schizophrenia, which is another kind of sad history, but interesting in the sense that you can imagine clinicians dealing with someone who's having active delusions, maybe acting out those delusions, maybe flailing about, feeling persecuted, being out of control. And so the first thing some clinician might choose to do is restrain the patient, which you can understand, but it could get severe. People would be locked up for days, chained to a bed. And also because they didn't necessarily know what to do, some horrific, almost medieval sounding treatments were used, like shock therapy, freezing water baths. We'll talk about frontal lobotomies. So these treatments were very extreme, and they weren't really effective either. We'll talk about frontal lobotomies in a moment. The plot is showing in this particular table. I should bring up a pointer here. Pointer options, laser pointer. Okay, so the plot you see here is the number of patients inside institutions, like maybe the horrible one you're seeing here. And so moving from the 1900s up to around 1954, 55 or so, this is the point when we finally figured out one particular drug, thorazine, that could actually treat schizophrenia. And so you can see the steady increase in the number of people with diagnosed and living in these institutions, perhaps under restraint, perhaps getting shock therapy. But then once we figured out at least one therapy, one chemical therapy, that plummeted, which is probably a very good thing, that they were able to get out of those institutions. All right. Let me see. Okay, yes. Physical restraint. I just want to mention that again. If you listen to the Ellen Sachs video, she talks about the horror of being physically restrained if you're schizophrenic. And we don't do that as much anymore, but it's still a potential issue. Okay, just as an aside, this is a show I enjoyed watching a couple of years back, Penny Dreadful. I don't know if you have any Penny Dreadful fans out there in the audience, but I really enjoyed it. But there was a couple scenes, I forgot which episode, but were pretty good depictions of this neo-Victorian era treatment for mental disorders. The restraint, as you see on the left, the cold water therapy they used in that show, the locked in the padded walls. And so there are some accurate depictions of how mental disorders are actually treated. But also, if you happen to like vampires, werewolves, I don't know, Frankenstein, witches, all that stuff, watch the show. It's actually pretty, I enjoyed it, pretty good. Okay, 20th century treatment, moving from the Victorian era to the 20th century. At least up to the mid-20th century, the treatments were at least as, I think, medieval as in the Victorian era. And one of those treatments, which is the most notorious, is the frontal lobotomy. It's notorious, but first let me say it was effective at removing these positive symptoms of schizophrenia, these people acting out, having delusions, being uncontrolled. But what is it? A frontal lobotomy is essentially a lesion destroying essentially a good chunk of your frontal cortex. So essentially killing a good portion of your frontal cortex. And it was a treatment for schizophrenia. It was developed originally in the 1930s. And then it was truly popularized in the United States by Walter Freeman, who actually went on a road show around the country to promote it. And it wasn't like it was not debated at the time. I mean, not everybody, and many people weren't really happy about this idea of lesioning and destroying a good chunk of the frontal cortex in these patients to treat the disorder. But it did definitely reduce their behaviors that were associated with schizophrenia. It made these patients much more placid, much more easy to control, more easy to suggest and do things. And so I think it was used because the people taking care of these patients, it made their lives a lot easier, but pretty extreme. All right. Yeah, you'd much rather have a bottle in front of you instead of a frontal lobotomy. The joke is, I'd much rather have a bottle in front of me than a frontal lobotomy. It's true. You would probably much rather have a bottle in front of you than a frontal lobotomy. About 50,000 of these lobotomies were performed in the United States, and this Walter Freeman performed between 3,500 and 5,000. So that's a lot of lesions. And it only decreased in the 1950s with the onset of chemical treatment. So as you might see in this picture, what the heck is going on there? Well, this is actually somewhat of a brilliant move, is that they figured out how to essentially lesion your frontal cortex without ever having to do a full surgery. You never even had to go under full general anesthesia. Although that was generally what was done. You go under anesthesia. And I mean, there was a local anesthetic, but this could be a really, really fast surgery and procedure. And essentially what it was is they were able to wiggle in what came down to an ice pick into the weak bone near your inner part of your eyeball, and then get that ice pick into the frontal cortex. I know it sounds gross. It is gross. And then wiggle it around in your frontal cortex until it pretty much destroys a good chunk of your frontal cortex. And believe it or not, that provided almost instantaneous relief of these behavioral outbursts and symptoms of schizophrenia. Here's a little diagram on the right here of one of the instruction manuals on how to perform frontal lobotomy, and shows you how to wiggle the little ice pick there. Yeah, don't do this at home or ever. Yeah, and so this is actually also a little bit of a disturbing thing. This was a little phrase on the left here from one of the consent forms that I think next of kin had to sign or whatever. I fully realize that this operation will have little effect on her mental condition, but I'm willing to have it done in the hope that she will be more comfortable and easier to care for. Well, probably much easier to care for, but maybe more comfortable. I don't know. So it's possible that, because it was effective at reducing a lot of these symptoms. but will have little effect on her mental condition. That is more than debatable. So you need a frontal cortex. It's that kind of what separates humans from most other mammals, is having a big frontal cortex. So it's there for something. What happens when you wipe it out? Probably not the best. Before I go on to that question, here's just another image I found on the web of from an instruction manual on how to get those little metal picks into a brain. All right. So what happens when you do wipe out a frontal cortex? Well, people do know it fairly well. I mean, they've studied it in schizophrenic patients for years, but also people who have strokes that affect their frontal cortex also exhibit symptoms. And so there is a common set of disorders, at least one of those disorders is called environmental dependency syndrome, that's accompanied or associated with damage to the frontal cortex. Now, damage to the frontal cortex is complex, as your frontal cortex has many different subregions that do many different things. But I'm going to generalize here and just to simplify things and just talk about one of those types of problems that can emerge with damage to your frontal cortex. And again, it's called environmental dependency syndrome. And it's like it says, it's like the words say. It's like you depend now on, if you don't have a frontal cortex, you no longer can really make planning or decisions anymore because you're really being driven from the environment. You're kind of a stimulus response machine. You see something, you either mimic it or you act on the stimulus you see. If you walk into a room and see a hammer on the table and a nail on the wall, you can't help yourself, but you know that you have to pick up the hammer because that's a stimulus, and you have to hammer the nail into the wall. It's you act on the stimuli you see. You also, people with this disorder and frontal cortex damage tend to mimic other people. So you might mimic, if somebody touches the nose, then you'll be compelled to touch your nose. And so this imitation game emerges with frontal damage. And like I said before, you're stimulus driven. If you see a bed, you might, even if you go to a stranger's house and you see a bed, you might just start taking off your clothes and go to sleep. See a water pitcher and a glass on the table, you'll pour water and drink again and again and again, even if you're no longer thirsty. If you see stairs, you'll start to walk up. It's like you're driven by the stimuli. There's a whole separate theory of affordances, which is like what a stimulus or an object is used for. That suggests that our brains are tuned to associate objects with their actions. And so you could almost think of schizophrenia, frontal damage, damage to your frontal cortex, as hyperactivating our responses to what things, the stimulus, the responses or actions that are associated with stimuli, their affordances. Okay. It's as if your goal-directed volitional brain system is gone away and that you're driven by stimuli in the environment. And so it's in many ways, you can think of this dependency syndrome as being the opposite of the positive, active symptoms of schizophrenia. Is that one issue with the positive symptoms is that you have these internal hallucinations and you're very much listening to all these crazy random generated thoughts and voices that are coming from your own internal mind, your own internal brain. But if you have environmental dependency syndrome, and perhaps if you have a frontal lobotomy, then those voices may no longer be there because you're now, instead of being driven by these internal voices generated by your own brain, you're now being driven by external stimuli. So perhaps that's one way the frontal lobotomy was able to reduce the positive symptoms, is that it cut off your brain's capacity to generate internal representations, internal, at least of other people or voices. And so you're now just driven entirely by the external world when you have your frontal cortex destroyed. All right, the frontal lobotomies, on the other hand, seem to enhance the negative symptoms of schizophrenia. So actually reduced motivation and movement even more so, which is a common symptom of schizophrenia in patients. And what's interesting is that frontal damage even though you can see definitely the problems when you have things like environmental dependency syndrome. But if you just were having a casual conversation with somebody with frontal damage, you may not even realize they have frontal damage. A general like person-to-person interaction might seem quite normal. It only starts to become apparent when you start like asking them to remember things over short intervals or making decision-making behaviors and things like that you start to notice. Or put like a hammer and a nail in front of them, and you realize they're driven by their stimuli. Okay, that is the end of part 1. Yeah, and the Arizona skunk right there from the camera.